Welcome. Rwanda, 1994. A Rwandan remembers. On the 7th of April, in the morning, they started burning houses over there and moving towards here. Only a few were killed. The burning pushed us to this place. Our group decided to run to this place. We thought this was God's house. No one would attack us here. On the 7th, 8th, up to the 10th, we were fighting them. We were using stones. They had pangas, that is machetes, spears, hammers, grenades. On the 10th, their numbers were increased. On the 14th, we were being pushed inside the church. The church was attacked on the 14th and the 15th. The actual killing was on the 15th. On the 15th, they brought the Presidential Guards. This was a unit of the Rwandan army. They were supporting the Interahamwe, who were the civilian militia death squads, brought in from neighboring communes. I was not in the group up here. Here there were women, children, and old men. The men had formed defense units outside. I was outside. Most men died fighting. When our defense was broken through, they came and killed everyone. After that, they started hunting for those hiding in the hills. I and others ran to the swamp. Another Rwandan remembers. The club is more crushing, but the machete is more natural. The Rwandan is accustomed to the machete from childhood. Grab a machete, that is what we do every morning. We cut sorghum, we prune banana trees, we hack out vines. We kill chickens. Even women and little girls borrow the machete for small tasks like chopping firewood. In the end, a man is like an animal. You give him a whack on the head or the neck, and down he goes. In the first days, someone who had already slaughtered chickens, and especially goats, had an advantage, understandably. Later, everybody grew accustomed to the new activity, and the laggards caught up. April 1994 was the month which saw South Africa's first democratic election, the election which brought Nelson Mandela to power. Exactly 3 weeks, 21 days before that election, on April the 6th, 1994, a plane carrying the president of Rwanda was shot down, killing him. Within hours began the largest genocide the world has seen since the Jewish Holocaust. As the Nigerian writer and Nobel Prize winner for literature, Wole Soyinka, said a bit later, South Africa is our dream, Rwanda our nightmare. The contemporary media coverage of Rwanda in 1994 vividly pronounced it to be a, quote, tribal bloodbath, unquote, bursting forth of the, quote, ancient hatreds, unquote, between the majority Hutu and the minority Tutsi. There is certainly some truth in this. It was certainly a bloodbath. Ethnicity was certainly a crucial aspect, as was hatred. But it's a classic example, I believe, of oversimplification based on flawed assumption. Let us try in this lecture to develop a firmer understanding, though I will state at the outset that for me, there will probably never be such thing as an explanation for the Rwanda genocide. There have been many fine works on this episode already, and I have listed a number of those in the suggested reading. Today I'll refer particularly to the work by Columbia University historian Mahmoud Manbani and by the remarkable book by the only Rwandan I know who's given an account, really a series of interviews, the late Andre Sibomana, a Rwandan, a Hutu, a Catholic priest, a distinguished journalist. One point that will emerge repeatedly, I think, is that we must take a regional perspective towards this history and this particular episode. It will not do to confine ourselves strictly to the boundaries of what is, after all, a quite small country, and that is Rwanda. So, historically, who are the Hutu and the Tutsi? Hutu in general refers, ancestrally speaking, to the original Iron Age Bantu farming peoples of the hilly, mountainous regions of today's Rwanda, Burundi, the eastern Congo. But they were of varied political and ethnic communities, and in fact, they became Hutu only when incorporated into the states which we will mention and which included the historical kingdom of Rwanda. Now, by mentioning those states, we beg the second question then about who are the Tutsi. Beginning several centuries ago, probably especially after the 15th century, migrants began to move into this region as well, mostly from the north and the east. This was not a single great migration, but rather a whole series of migrant streams over a very considerable period of time, interacting in complex ways with the original population. Now, in the 20th century, this whole process was greatly oversimplified and distorted. And this gave birth to what I'll refer to as the Hamitic hypothesis, which in a nutshell suggested that peoples of very different origin from the original Iron Age Bantu peoples, from far to the north in today's Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa, who were Hamitic, the word comes from the biblical character of Ham, or even Semitic peoples, came rather suddenly, imposed their dominance in a short time, and created the kingdoms that we're talking about. By Semitic or Hamitic, the strong suggestion in the colonial period was that they were, if you will forgive the term, less Negro. They were, as Mahmoud Mamdani puts it, Caucasians of a lesser breed. Now, despite its simplifications, it is fair to say that the term Tutsi originates with these more recent arrivals, who in some cases indeed were able to establish power over the older indigenes and who tended to hold substantial wealth in cattle. The nearest translation of Tutsi in English turns out to be something like the word aristocracy, suggesting a class perhaps rather than a narrowly ethnic status. In my early lecture on ethnicity, lecture number 6, I emphasized that ethnic identity is fluid, it's changeable, it's a matter of self-perception and a matter of perception by others. Nonetheless, in an attempt to give us something to go by in order to determine ethnic difference, I did suggest that probably the best bet criterion would be difference in language. I also hasten to add to that no single criterion, including language, works 100% of the time. Well, here is your proof. Hutu and Tutsi, parties to the deadliest ethnic violence in Africa's history, speak the same language, Kinyarwanda. Now, over time, several kingdoms emerged in this region, and at the top, in the royal families, the kings were all Tutsi. At the lower levels, however, there were quite a number of regional chiefs, sub-rulers, governors, if you like, who were Hutu. There was certainly inequality, although it tended to be a linked relationship of inequality as opposed to a strict caste inequality. Cattle holders, mostly Tutsi, had clients, mostly Hutu. There were some poor Tutsi, later the Belgians called them the Petit Tutsi, and some well-off Hutu. But in general, you see a picture here of Tutsi association with power and greater wealth, Hutu otherwise. But there was also considerable intermarriage between the two, including some intermarriage into the royalty. Some people whose ancestry was at least partly Hutu became, if you like, and were accepted as Tutsi. Still, it seemed to emerge as the rule, and remains the case today, that everyone appears to fall into one category or the other, following the patrilineal rules that we also saw in Lecture 6. If your father was a Tutsi, you were Tutsi. If your father a Hutu, you were Hutu. And there was conflict in the long ago pre-colonial period. But the conflict was usually not between Tutsi and Hutu, but between rival political states, kingdoms, composed of both. Eventually, through consolidation, two principal kingdoms emerged. One was Rwanda to the north, the other, with a very similar ethnic makeup, Burundi, just next door to the south. Now, physically, the stereotype, and this is an important part of this entire history and story, the stereotype of Hutu and Tutsi, and I rush to add here a stereotype held by many Rwandans, this is not merely something imposed or believed by outsiders, has been essentially this. Tutsi are taller, they're slender, they have narrow facial features. Hutu tend to be shorter, squatter, if you like, with broader facial features. But these stereotypes, like so many stereotypes, including stereotypes about physical appearance, consider the stereotypes of Swedes versus Spanish, for instance. There are so many exceptions to these that one wonders where the rule really winds up. And let me show how reality confounds these stereotypes as often as it confirms them. I'll go to a short account given by the distinguished Sudanese scholar, Francis Deng, who before the genocide, he's writing this in 1995 afterwards, but he delivered a presentation before it to next door in Burundi to a quite high-level group. And I'll give you his own encounter here as he spoke, much as I'm speaking, to a group in that region. I had come to know more or less the stereotypical description of the short Negroid Hutu and the tall, fine-featured Hamitic Tutsis. As I looked at my audience, I saw a few who were clearly Tutsis and a few who were clearly Hutus. But most were somewhere in between, and I could not identify them. I later asked the Burundis, including senior government officials and ministers, whether they could tell a Tutsi from a Hutu. The response of the foreign minister, which represented the general tone, was a confident yes, but, quote, with a margin of error of 35%, unquote. And Dang comments, a remarkable margin given the confidence of the affirmative answer. Indeed, even the Hutu murderers of 1994 often had to look at identification cards before deciding whom to kill. Rwanda and Burundi were originally colonized by Germany, but when Germany lost the First World War, Belgium took them over. When we consider the colonial period and its possible relationship to the history that we're talking about here, you might assume that I'm going to reiterate a point which I've made several points at several junctures in this course, and that is that colonial boundaries tended to be artificial, that they tended to throw together ethnic communities that were not in the same political unit prior to colonialism, and therefore perhaps sow the seeds in some ways for civil war between rival ethnic groupings. That is not the case with Rwanda. Just as in the case of language difference here, we have an exceptional situation rather than a typical one for Africa. Rwanda is one of the few cases where a colonial country, and today's independent Rwanda, actually bears some realistic relationship to the pre-colonial boundaries of the kingdom known as Rwanda. So we have to look beyond the mere question of borders and boundaries to examine the colonial impact and what legacy it may have had for independent Rwanda. It mainly boils down to this. Both the Germans and the Belgians, but especially the Belgians, found it useful, found it quite convenient to view the Tutsi as natural aristocrats, so-called. They both favored Tutsi and depended upon them. There was a sort of sub-imperialism or sub-colonialism which developed in Rwanda. As one Tutsi put it in describing his relationship with the Belgian colonial officials, he said that they told him, "You whip the Hutu or we will whip you." It's equally true, however, that many Tutsi took advantage of the opportunities, the favoritism that they were granted under Belgian rule, and were able to do quite well out of the same relationship. This was the real heyday of the Hamitic hypothesis, this notion that there was an original indigenous population here, the Hutu, and this alien aristocratic, more Caucasian and less Negro aristocracy which had come centuries before and which were the natural choices for both favoritism and assistance in the colonial enterprise. Almost all the officially recognized chiefs in colonial times were indeed Tutsi. The Catholic Church, which dominated the education system, similarly favored the Tutsi, who became the principal members of a new kind of literate, Western-educated elite. There were exceptions, Hutu who became educated as well, but they were relatively few. The Belgian bureaucracy froze this ethnic identity in a sense, and this was indeed symbolized several decades before the end of colonialism by the starting of the issuing of identity cards bearing a Hutu or Tutsi designation. Inequality then in the colonial period was greatly sharpened. It became much closer, it emerged as something much closer to a true caste relationship. In Mamdani's analysis, what were ethnic differences became indeed racialized, reflected in the Hamitic hypotheses, and greatly deepened. In the 1950s, as in most colonies, as we've seen before, it was the educated elite, and in this case that was largely Tutsi, which began to clamor for self-government. But there were some Hutu, a budding counter-elite, if you like, who seized the moment of the colonial twilight and issued their own Hutu manifesto in 1957. It's worth quoting from that document a little bit to see how this Hamitic hypothesis is in fact seized for their own purposes by both Hutu and Tutsi. According to the Hutu manifesto, quote, the heart of the matter is, quote, the conflict between the Hutu and Hamitic, i.e. foreign Tutsi, unquote. They sought a double liberation, quote, both from the Hamites and the Bazungu, that's the reference to the whites, colonization. That the, quote, indigenous racial problem, their term, was the, quote, monopoly which is held by one race, the Tutsi. This was followed in 1959 by what is usually called the Hutu Social Revolution, and indeed it was just that. It resulted in the ending of the Rwandan kingship, the replacement of almost all chiefs by Hutu. The Belgians did an incredible about-face, as of course they did next door in the Congo, at the last minute of their colonial legacy, and indeed not only allowed but promoted this sudden reversal at the twilight of their own power there. In elections leading to independence in 1962, a Hutu-dominated government came to power. Now, I review this colonial history not to blame the Belgians. That seems like a gross reach to me for a colonial power which departed over 4 decades ago. I think that André Sibomana captures actually the importance and the limitations of the colonial period as an explanation rather well. Listen to him. If the settlers, he means the Belgians there, had taken into account the realities of the country, if they had refrained from imposing their simplified vision, no doubt Rwanda's history would have been very different. If power had not been given in its entirety to one group, the Tutsi, to the detriment of other groups, and if subsequently it had not been taken away in its entirety from that group and handed over in its entirety to another group, the Hutu, we might have been able to avoid a genocide. If colonization were to be put on trial, that is where the accusations would be leveled. The Belgian settlers implanted racist stereotypes which we were not able to shake off, but the responsibility of these settlers should not obscure the responsibility of Hutu and Tutsi extremists, who, one after the other and each in their own way, exploited these stereotypes and served the purposes of their struggle to conquer, to hold on to power. And a bit later, I don't believe anything, quote, necessarily brought on the genocide in Rwanda, said Sibomana. Men are products, but not prisoners of their history. They decide themselves what to do. Well, uncertainties over what independence would bring exacerbated tensions, and as the post-colonial era progressed, these did not diminish. The early anti-Tutsi moves in 1959, particularly between 59 and 63, smaller-scale killings of Tutsi, pogroms, if you like, to use the old Eastern European term, propelled the first waves of Tutsi going into exile, mainly to Uganda. Eventually, some 600,000 Tutsi would wind up in Uganda, where they not only sought to mobilize and organize themselves politically, but eventually militarily, in a movement known as the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF. By the 1970s, Rwanda was in the sort of tailspin that we observed in lectures 29 and 30 affecting so much of independent Africa. Declining terms of trade, unfulfilled expectations. As if more problems were needed, next door in Burundi, there were mass killings of Hutu by Tutsi in 1972, which propelled large numbers of Hutu refugees northward into Rwanda. In 1973, a coup d'etat, which we've seen in other countries, of course, occurred, and President Juvenal Habyarimana seized power, which he held for 21 years. Within Hutu inner circles, there developed moderate and extremist factions with regard to the so-called Tutsi problem. These divisions between the radical Hutu power advocates within the Hutu community and those seeking some sort of accommodation with the Tutsi, especially the exiled Tutsi, were brought to a head by a critical event in the explanation of this whole episode, and that is the invasion of northern Rwanda by the Tutsi-led RPF, the exiles coming from Uganda, beginning in October of 1990. Indeed, between 1990 and 1994, when the genocide occurred, this country was in a state of what amounted to civil war. And it was the fear utilized and exploited by Hutu extremists through powerful propaganda instruments day after day that the Tutsi are on the march. They are coming. You must do to them first what they will do to you. This sort of message broadcast in radio, seen in the extremist newspapers, again, a product of fear generated in a civil war in which the deteriorating Rwandan army was in fact losing ground month after month to the invading RPF. Again, the external factors. In October 1993, the first Hutu president of Burundi, where you had not had a Hutu revolution before, was assassinated by apparently members of a Tutsi-dominated army. New waves of Hutu fearing again that the Tutsi are going to reimpose the Hamitic hypothesis sort of domination. These sorts of fears begin to emerge and grow almost day by day. Now, President Habyarimana had sort of been on the fence between the moderate Hutu and the extremist, who began to call in not very veiled terms for something like an extermination. Habyarimana, though, eventually moved towards the possibility of tolerance, at least reconciliation, and in fact, he signed Arusha Accords. Arusha is the town in northern Tanzania where negotiations between his government and the Tutsi-dominated RPF took place. Signed agreements in August of 1993. And in fact, he was returning from a further negotiating session in Arusha on April the 6th, 1994, when his plane was brought down by a missile attack over the airport. It is still not clear who carried out that attack. It was certainly well planned. It's possible, many believed at the time, and of course this fanned the flames of fear, that the RPF had carried out the attack and that therefore you can see what they have in mind for Tutsi domination in Rwanda. Many believe now that in fact it was extremist Hutu who brought down the plane in order to forestall Habyarimana's efforts at some kind of negotiated accommodation. Within hours, the extremists seized power after the assassination of the president and launched what we now know is a well-prepared and coordinated plan for a final solution. And I mean a final solution in the same sense that Hitler and the Nazis meant it. The elimination of the Tutsi population once and for all. Some of their earliest targets, however, were not Tutsi at all, but Hutu moderates, and there were quite a number of them. Some 50,000 of them eventually were killed. The army carried out some operations of the genocide, but in the swamps, as the killing fields were called, and as you saw in my opening quote, sometimes in the churches. It was usually the Interahamwe, the ragtag Hutu militias, drawn from the impoverished youth, male youth mainly, around the cities, who took care of the Inyenzi, the cockroaches, as the Tutsi came to be called, the vermin, the filth. And it must be said that there were large numbers of ordinary people who took part. Fewer of the Hutu courageously shielded Tutsi or moderate Hutu from the killers, but they were fewer. And it is this that is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire genocide. When they asked Sibomana to explain that, he said, "I don't explain it. You can't explain everything or understand all forms of human behavior. It's a fact. During the genocide, not only were hundreds of thousands of people killed, but many were victims of cruelty, torture, and forms of ill treatment which defy imagination." Where did it come from, this hatred of others? I can only explain it by an insurmountable hatred of oneself. Indeed, some killers committed suicide after they had killed. They were many, especially among young people from poor districts of the capital, whose lives were completely empty, who had no family, no religion, no work, no hope. They saw no future for themselves in the world. They turned upside down the value system to which they no longer had access. Instead of taking advantage of their youth to build themselves a life, they used their energy to destroy the lives of others. The world, despite considerable intelligence before and after April 6, essentially did nothing. The United Nations force, of peacekeepers, was actually reduced as the crisis deepened and was pathetically inadequate in any case. In hindsight, the inaction seems unforgivable. Even President Clinton, who was in power at that time, actually went to Rwanda later and apologized, essentially, for his own inaction. It's still worth saying, though, that an intervention at the time might have been labeled in some quarters as Western imperialism. Indeed, from some of the same quarters who later condemned the inaction. The genocide ended in July 1994 with the successful taking of Kigali by the RPF, by the Tutsi-led exiles. But by that time, some 2 million Hutu refugees were on their way, and these included many of the so-called génocidaires, those who'd carried it out, on their way into the eastern Congo. There, they were part of the ensuing destabilization which contributed to the downfall of President Mobutu in Congo, which we saw in an earlier lecture. And this is part of the ongoing Greater Great Lakes conflagration that has devastated that region. In Rwanda, some sort of basic stability has been restored, which is remarkable enough. There have been serious efforts to deal with the genocide and its aftermath. A UN-sponsored International Criminal Tribunal operating in Tanzania has brought and is bringing criminal cases and has obtained convictions for some of the organizers of the killings who will serve their lives in prison. Internally, there have also been prosecutions, but the RPF government certainly has its own bases for criticism. There remain today tens of thousands of suspects held in facilities like stadiums. This is a source of tension in itself. Perhaps most promising have been the efforts to commemorate and remember the grassroots initiative, the so-called gacaca process of local-level investigations conducted in the old African way, if I can put it that way, of getting at what happened in a particular community and trying to promote some sort of accounting and at least tolerance, if not reconciliation. Andre Sibomana's book is entitled Hope for Rwanda, which seems almost incredible. He himself died in 1998 of a rare allergenic disease. It's a sad thing to say, but his friends were almost relieved to find that he had died of that cause, given the alternatives in Rwanda and the fact that he continued his criticism of injustice wherever he found it. I'll nonetheless end with words from Andre Sibomana. We don't have the right to give up hope. Life has been given to us. It is a gift from God. As a believer, and especially as a priest who must help others find the way, I don't have the right not to hope. We must learn to live together again. Some diplomats who presumably thought that we would never be able to live together again have suggested creating a Hutu land or a Tutsi land. This idea is not only stupid, but very harmful. Apart from the fact that a division of Rwandans along these lines would be a magnificent victory for advocates of racism, I don't think that problems are solved by shifting them or pushing them to one side. Quite the contrary. And finally, the last words of his book. Just before leaving Kigali, one of my journalists asked me this question. So when will Rwandans ever be able to hope to die of old age? That is my wish now. Let us give Rwandans time to live, and let us give children time to bury their parents. Bury their parents dead of old age. Thank you.